have ideas.
Thanks, God. That's another one I owe you.
My sister's here. Can I put you on hold?
Remember those major child stars? The ones who left hit TV shows just when we loved them most? They were part of our homes, our routines, our memories. But behind the bright lights, something was unraveling. And maybe leaving was the only way they could stay whole. There is something about Gary Coleman that still feels larger than life, even when we look back through the grainy footage of different strokes. The charm was unmatched, the timing was perfect, and the catchphrases, well, you still hear them echoing now and then on reruns. But the story of this major child star is not just about how he lit up the screen. It is about how quickly that light dimmed when the cameras stopped rolling. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Gary was not just acting. He was carrying a television show. He was the whole event. His portrayal of Arnold Jackson made him one of the most famous child actors in America. He was earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year before he even hit puberty, and that was a big deal because he needed every cent. Gary had been born with a rare kidney condition that stunted his growth and required regular dialysis. Hollywood gave him a platform and a paycheck, but it never really gave him peace. As the show kept pulling in ratings and profits, the tension behind the scenes started rising. Gary was growing up, but not in the way most kids do. Because of his health, he stayed small in stature, and the producers tried to freeze him in time, forever playing the precocious, wide-eyed little brother even as he became a teenager with opinions. That was not just awkward, it was infuriating for him. And it did not help that the adults around him were not exactly offering guidance out of kindness. Lawsuits began piling up. His adoptive parents and former business advisor were eventually taken to court by Gary himself for mismanaging his trust fund. The money he worked so hard for, millions of dollars, had quietly disappeared. Just like that. By the late seasons, Gary was deeply unhappy on set. He resented the direction the show had taken and felt exploited by the very system that made him a household name. He started clashing with the producers, and the show's tone changed. What was once lighthearted and fun became tense and fractured. When Different Strokes was finally canceled in the mid-80s, Gary had already emotionally checked out. What followed was even harder to watch than the decline of the show. Gary tried to move on, but the industry had already closed its doors. He worked odd jobs, took small roles, and even briefly became a security guard. Public appearances often turned into punchlines. It was like the world forgot he was a kid once, one who made people laugh even while he was hurting. In interviews later in life, Gary was brutally honest about the industry, about his family, about the toll it took. He once said, "I have nothing. No job, no career, no family, no friends, no money, no nothing. You do not say something like that unless you have seen the darkest corners of fame." And he had. Gary passed away in 2010, alone and in debt. But for a little while, he was one of the brightest lights on television. And sometimes that is the hardest part to remember, that it all looked so joyful. Until it wasn't. Dana Plato's story is not just tragic, it is haunting. You do not have to have watched Different Strokes to know her face. You could see it on magazine covers, on late-night talk shows, and eventually on the news. As Kimberly Drummond, she was America's sweetheart. But behind the smile and the soft voice was someone quietly falling apart. Dana came into the role with the kind of energy that made her instantly relatable. She was not a caricature. She was a teenager with real emotions, often acting as the moral center of the show. In a cast built on big laughs, Dana brought something smaller, more grounded, and people loved her for it. But like so many young stars, her personal life was spiraling out of sync with her character. In the early 1980s, Dana shocked producers and fans alike when she became pregnant at 19. At the time, that kind of thing was not just frowned upon, it could be career-ending. And for her, it was. She was written off the show. Just like that. No send-off, no real explanation. She was just gone. It felt unfair, even then. The same people who cheered for her on screen turned their backs when she needed understanding the most. She tried to get back into acting, but the roles were scarce, and the industry was cruel. Dana turned to B-movies and small-budget thrillers, trying to keep her name afloat in a sea that was never meant to hold her for long. And then came the spiral. Drugs, run-ins with the law, rehab stints, and eventually, a robbery that turned her into a national punchline. She held up a video store with a pellet gun. That is not something you do unless you have run out of good ideas, and maybe hope too. She was arrested and released, only to appear on talk shows the next day where she was ridiculed instead of helped. Dana's story was not just a what-happened tale, it was a mirror. It showed what fame does when it forgets to check in on its youngest stars. It showed how easily a rising career can turn into a cautionary tale. She said once in an interview that she wished she had never been famous, because fame gave her everything except peace. She tried to get clean, she tried to rebuild her life. But sometimes trying is not enough when the damage runs that deep. In 1999, Dana Plato died of an overdose in her motorhome. It was ruled a suicide. She was 34 years old. There are not many things more heartbreaking than watching someone lose their way after giving the world so much of themselves. Dana was not just a child actor. She was a daughter, a mother, a woman who could not find her way back. Not all stories get second acts, and that is what makes hers so painful to remember. Jamie Lynn Spears was never just a younger sibling. She was a phenomenon in her own right. At the height of Zoe 101, she was the face of Nickelodeon, confident, magnetic, and exactly the kind of girl other kids wanted to be. She had her own show, her own fan base, and for a few years, her own orbit. And then, all at once, that orbit collapsed. In 2007, Jamie Lynn was only 16 years old when the news broke. She was pregnant. It was not a rumor. It was real. The girl who played a boarding school honor student on television was about to become a teen mother in real life. And the reaction? It was not just critical. It was unforgiving. Overnight, everything changed. Nickelodeon distanced itself. The press circled like vultures. Parents' groups raged. The internet, still finding its voice back then, tore her apart. Jamie Lynn was forced to step down from Zoe 101. And just like that, the show ended. Not because the ratings were low or the writing failed, but because its star was no longer allowed to be a role model. But if you were watching closely, you could tell she never asked to be one in the first place. Jamie Lynn's early fame came fast. She had made appearances on All That, dipped into the music scene, and then suddenly became the center of her own universe with Zoe 101. It was a polished world built on high school fantasy. Malibu sunshine, beachside dorms, drama that ended before the next commercial. But that fantasy was built on the real-life pressure of working 12-hour days, hitting marks, memorizing scripts, and smiling on cue. That is a lot to ask from a child. When she left, she did not just walk off a set. She walked into one of the most emotionally raw periods of her life, with cameras still watching. Becoming a mother at 16 is hard. Becoming one while the world calls you irresponsible, a cautionary tale, a disappointment, that is something else entirely. She moved back to Louisiana, away from the spotlight. She focused on her child, and she was quiet. No grand statements, no televised comeback, no tell-all interviews. Just silence, a silence that was both protective and painful. It would be years before Jamie Lynn returned to the public eye, and even then, it was not to reclaim her child star past. She tried her hand at country music, released an EP, and slowly rebuilt her life on her own terms. But for many, the image of her as the girl who ruined a hit show still lingered. The truth is, Jamie Lynn did not ruin anything. She grew up. She made a decision, a difficult one. And the industry she had once carried on her shoulders made it clear she was no longer welcome the moment she stopped fitting their idea of what a teen star should be. Her story is not a fall from grace. It is the story of someone who had to become an adult before she even finished being a kid. That kind of pressure does not leave scars. It leaves silence. And in that silence, she found something no one expected, a life beyond the screen. Taron Noah Smith was not the typical teen heartthrob. He was quiet, thoughtful, and never quite comfortable with the fame that came with home improvement. As Mark Taylor, the youngest of three sitcom brothers, Taron played the sweet, often overlooked kid, a role that mirrored parts of his real life more than anyone knew. For 8 seasons, he showed up to work, hit his lines, and helped create one of the most successful family shows on American television. But when the show ended, he made a choice that very few child actors ever do. He walked away. Not just from acting, but from the entire industry. Taron was only 17 when Home Improvement wrapped in 1999. Most kids in his position would have leveraged that fame into more roles, maybe a movie deal, maybe a high-profile appearance or two. But not Taron. He saw something in the machine of Hollywood that made him uneasy, and instead of pretending it was fine, he spoke up and got out. He later said he never really wanted to be an actor in the first place, that it was something his parents guided him into, that the money he made, millions of dollars, felt like it came at the cost of a normal childhood. He was one of the rare few who did not just experience child stardom, he questioned it. And the moment he turned 18, he sued his parents for control of his trust fund. That legal battle lit up the tabloids. People were quick to paint him as ungrateful. But what he was really doing was trying to reclaim something that had never truly been his independence. He won the case. But more than that, he stepped into a version of adulthood that most former child stars never find. He moved into a house with his then-girlfriend, who was 16 years older. The media mocked it, fixated on the age difference, as if it was stranger than the idea of a child being famous before finishing middle school. They did not ask why he made those choices. They just judged him for not sticking to the script. In the years that followed, Taron started a vegan food company. He focused on sustainability, living off-grid, doing things that did not involve applause or studio lights. He did not miss acting, and he did not regret leaving. He talked openly about how isolating fame had been, how adults treated him like a product, how the smiling image of his television family often clashed with the reality of growing up under constant pressure, and how, even after the camera stopped rolling, people still expected him to be someone he never really was. Taron Noah Smith did not fall apart. He stepped away. That makes his story rare. It is not a tragedy. It is a statement. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is quit, even when the world thinks you should be grateful, even when they call you difficult or weird or lost, because sometimes lost is just another word for free. Brian Bonsall was the kind of kid you remembered even if you forgot the show. Small frame, shaggy hair, big grin, the perfect picture of a sitcom son. When he joined Family Ties as Andy Keaton in the later seasons, he fit right in. He was cute, clever, and somehow managed to hold his own next to Michael J. Fox, which was no small task in the late 1980s. Brian became a regular fixture in American homes almost overnight. But the strange thing is, for someone who was everywhere, he disappeared just as fast. Once Family Ties ended, Brian kept working for a while. He had the look, the timing, and the fan base. He did movies like Blank Check, a fantasy kids film that put him front and center. And for a moment, it seemed like he would make that tricky jump from child actor to teen star. But then, nothing. By the mid-1990s, Brian was done with Hollywood. No big scandal, no dramatic exit. He just stopped showing up on screens. A lot of people assumed he had faded into the usual pool of forgotten child actors. But the truth was more complicated. Brian had not just walked away from acting. He had walked into a life that was far less scripted and far more chaotic. In the years that followed, his name started showing up again, but not in TV guides, in police reports. He was arrested multiple times throughout the 2000s, mostly for assault and substance-related charges. It was the kind of news that hits differently when it is someone you watched grow up on your television. You start asking the usual questions. What happened? How did he get here? But maybe the better question is, what did we expect? Brian had been working professionally since he was 5 years old. He was famous before he had a chance to understand what fame even meant. And once the cameras stopped, there was no guidebook for what came next. No director calling the shots. No audience clapping. Just real life. And real life, as it turns out, is not easy when all you have ever known is playing pretend. He later admitted he struggled with identity, addiction, and finding his place outside the industry. Fame had given him a role, but it had not given him direction. And when you are used to being told who to be, figuring that out on your own can feel like trying to solve a puzzle without knowing what the picture is supposed to look like. But this story does not end in ruin. Over time, Brian started to rebuild. He got sober. He went back to school. He found music and began performing in punk bands, something that gave him expression without expectation. He got married. He found balance. Still, the shadow of child stardom never quite disappears. It lingers in the background, like a line you forgot to finish delivering. Brian never asked for that spotlight, and when it faded, it took years to see clearly again. But what he found, on his own terms, was a version of himself that did not need applause, just peace. Jodie Sweetin was the heart of Full House in a way most people forget. Sure, everyone remembers Uncle Jesse's hair and Michelle's one-liners. But Stephanie Tanner, that middle child with the sass, the softness, and the iconic "How rude," was the show's emotional anchor. And Jodie Sweetin played her like she had been born to do it. From the outside, she seemed to have it all. A loving on-screen family, a hit show, and a place in one of the most beloved sitcoms of the 1990s. But behind the laughter and pastel-colored sets, Jodie was fighting a battle that no one saw coming. She started on Full House when she was just 5 years old. For 8 seasons, she grew up under the harsh lights of a sitcom set. While other kids were learning to ride bikes and navigate grade school, she was memorizing lines and performing in front of millions. And when the show finally ended in 1995, the structure that had shaped her entire life vanished overnight. Without that routine, that safety net, the world became a lot louder and a lot lonelier. Jodie has spoken candidly about how that silence after the applause became deafening. She turned to alcohol and drugs at a young age. Meth, cocaine, ecstasy. It was not recreational, it was desperate. She was trying to fill a void that childhood fame had carved out with surgical precision. It is jarring to think about how someone so funny, so bright, could be hurting so badly. But that is the thing about early fame. It teaches you how to be liked, not how to be okay. For years, Jodie bounced between recovery and relapse. She tried to finish school, to lead a normal life, but the shadows of her past followed her. Every time she walked into a room, she was not Jodie. She was Stephanie, and that is not a bad thing until it is the only thing. Eventually, she got clean. Not overnight, not without stumbles. But she did it. She went back to school. She became a mother. She started speaking out about addiction and recovery. And when Fuller House came around decades later, she returned, not as a child clinging to fame, but as an adult choosing it on her terms. Her story is not just about struggle. It is about survival, about clawing your way out of something that millions of people assume is a dream, but for some, can be a nightmare. She has said that the industry gave her a career, but it never taught her how to live. So she had to figure that out herself. And she did. Slowly. Painfully. Beautifully. Today, Jodie Sweetin is more than just Stephanie Tanner. She is proof that you can lose your way and still come back stronger. That even when the credits roll, your story is not over. It is just beginning again. Lisa Loring was Wednesday Addams before Wednesday. Addams was cool. Long before streaming hits and stylized reboots, it was Lisa, braided pigtails, solemn eyes, and deadpan delivery, who gave life to one of the most iconic characters in American television. She was only 6 years old when she first appeared on The Addams Family in 1964, but from the very first episode, she was unforgettable. Quieter than the rest of the cast, but somehow even more magnetic. And for a time, she felt like the future. But the future had other plans. Lisa's version of Wednesday wasn't sarcastic or over the top. She was innocent in the strangest way possible, sewing headless dolls, calmly talking about death with a child's curiosity. It was the kind of role that burned itself into the cultural imagination, and it should have been a launch pad for something bigger, but it wasn't. When The Addams Family ended in 1966, Lisa was only 8, and just like that, the phone stopped ringing. For most child stars, the challenge is growing out of a role. For Lisa, it was growing up at all. She had been typecast so completely, so visually, that producers could not, or would not, see her as anything else. And Hollywood moved on. New faces, new shows, new fads. The weird little girl with the haunting stare did not fit into the sunny sitcoms or teen dramas that dominated the late 1960s and 1970s. So she disappeared from view, quietly, almost like she had never been there. Lisa did some modeling, a few television appearances here and there, but nothing ever stuck. And the older she got, the more obvious it became that her fame was frozen in time. Like the show itself, she had become black and white in a world that had moved on to color. But life off-screen was anything but still. Lisa married young, at just 15, and had her first child not long after. She went through multiple marriages, faced addiction, and spent much of her adult life trying to navigate a world that only remembered her as a child. That kind of memory becomes a burden when no one is interested in who you became, only who you were. It is easy to forget that child fame can be a trap. It looks like a gift, feels like a head start. But sometimes it just anchors you to a version of yourself that no longer exists. Lisa never committed any public scandals. She never lashed out or spiraled in front of cameras. She just faded into the background, a footnote to a character the world refused to let go of. And maybe that is the most haunting part. Lisa Loring passed away in 2023. Her obituary mentioned Wednesday Addams right away, because of course it did. That was the role. That was the image. That was the legacy. But behind the still frames and black and white reruns was a woman who lived an entire life outside that shadow, and who never really got the chance to be seen for anything more. It is a reminder, gentle, eerie, and painful, that childhood fame does not always carry forward. Sometimes it flickers once and never returns. Tina Yothers came into Family Ties like a spark, full of energy, with that signature blonde hair and no-nonsense attitude. As Jennifer Keaton, she was the youngest of the siblings, a grounded, tomboyish contrast to the idealistic parents and her wildly ambitious brother Alex. And for millions of viewers, she was just as important to the show's chemistry as any of them. She held her own next to giants, and she did it with a kind of quiet confidence that made her instantly lovable. But like so many child stars, Tina's story is not about what happened while the cameras were rolling. It is about what happened when they stopped. Tina was only 9 years old when Family Ties started airing. By the time it ended in 1989, she had spent more than half her life in that role. Most kids graduate middle school and high school with memories of classrooms and friends. Tina graduated with scripts, call times, and studio applause. Her identity was built inside a television set, and when the set came down, so did the sense of who she was supposed to be. Tina tried to continue acting after the show ended, but the roles weren't coming. She was not the precocious little sister anymore. She was a teenager, then a young adult, someone Hollywood did not know what to do with. There was no scandal, no headline-making crash, just a quiet withdrawal from the spotlight, one that almost felt planned. But it wasn't. She struggled with the same thing so many child actors face: invisibility. People knew her face, but not her voice. They remembered Jennifer, not Tina. And when you have spent your formative years being told who to be, figuring that out on your own feels like walking without a map. She turned to music for a while, starting a band and experimenting with a punk rock image that seemed to shout, "This is who I am now." It was bold, it was different, and it was maybe a little desperate. Not for attention, but for identity. Later in life, Tina appeared on a few reality shows, Celebrity Fit Club, What Not to Wear, things like that. And with each appearance, she was met with the same reaction: surprise. Surprised that she looked different, surprised that she had stepped away, surprised that time had passed, as if people expected her to still be 11 years old, cracking jokes in the Keaton living room. That is the strange curse of growing up on television. You grow up, but the world keeps watching reruns. Tina has spoken openly about her choice to leave Hollywood behind, about wanting to raise a family, live a private life, and be known for something other than who she was as a child. And she has done just that, a quiet life on her own terms. Her story is not tragic, but it is telling. It reminds us that sometimes the hardest thing about fame is knowing when to walk away and who you are when you do. Because even the most memorable characters eventually leave the screen, and what is left behind is not always applause. Sometimes it is just silence, and the person learning how to live in it. Ariana Richards did something that not many child stars manage to do. She walked away at the peak of her fame, and she did it without a meltdown, without a scandal, and without burning a single bridge. In a world where child actors are often remembered more for how they fall apart than how they rise, Ariana's story quietly flips the script. Because when Jurassic Park hit theaters in 1993, she was more than just a supporting character. She was part of a cultural tidal wave. As Lex Murphy, Ariana captured exactly what it felt like to be young and terrified in a world gone wrong. And she did it with such realism that even now, decades later, people still remember her scream. That scene in the kitchen? The raptors? Her wide eyes as she whispered, "It's a Unix system, I know this." That was Ariana. That was the moment, and she was just 13. But what happened next surprised everyone. Most people expected her to transition into more roles, maybe become the next big teen star. She had already done commercials, television movies, and guest spots on shows like The Golden Girls and Empty Nest. She had range, she had recognition, but she did not have the hunger for more. Instead, after a few more roles, including a small return in The Lost World, Ariana faded from the screen. Not because she was being pushed out, not because she was struggling, but because she had made a different choice. One you almost never hear about in these kinds of stories. She chose art. Ariana enrolled at Skidmore College and majored in fine arts. While most of her peers in Hollywood were navigating agents, auditions, and late-night calls from tabloids, Ariana was painting, studying classical techniques, falling in love with light and shadow, texture and color. She found a new medium for expression, one that did not require scripts or makeup chairs or being recognized at the grocery store. And she thrived. She built a career as a professional painter, specializing in landscapes and portraits. Her work was featured in galleries, sold to collectors, and quietly built her a second chapter that had nothing to do with dinosaurs or sound stages. She even won awards. Not nostalgia awards, not former child star awards, real ones, for her art, for her skill. It is hard to overstate how rare that is because fame, especially early fame, is sticky. It clings. People do not like to let go of who they think you are. For Ariana, that meant constantly being pulled back into conversations about one movie, even as she tried to create a new path for herself. But she handled that tension with grace. She never disowned her past, never pretended she wasn't grateful. She just made it clear that it was not her whole identity. Ariana Richards did not disappear. She transformed. And she did it without losing herself in the process. No public breakdown, no long apology tour, just an exit. Quiet, intentional, and real. Because sometimes the most powerful decision a child star can make is to say, "This is enough," and then paint the rest of their life in their own colors. Eve Plum was Jan Brady, and that, for better or worse, was a title that stuck. With her straight blonde hair, soft voice, and famous middle child complex, she became a symbol of every kid who ever felt overshadowed. Marcia, Marcia, Marcia was more than just a line. It was a cultural moment, one that Eve helped create, one that she could never quite escape. But unlike many of her co-stars, Eve made a decision early on. She was not going to spend the rest of her life trying to chase or revive that one role. The Brady Bunch aired from 1969 to 1974. It was not a massive ratings hit during its original run, but syndication turned it into a pop culture juggernaut. Suddenly, the show was everywhere. And so were the cast. Lunchboxes, dolls, reruns every afternoon. Eve Plum was inescapable. But when the show ended, something shifted. While others leaned into the nostalgia, Eve stepped back. Way back. She skipped out on several of the Brady Bunch reunion specials. She declined to reprise her role as Jan in some of the television movies. And when asked why, her answer was always the same. She wanted to do different work. She wanted to grow. She wanted something more. And for that, she was often misunderstood. People assumed she was bitter, difficult, maybe even ungrateful. But the truth is more complicated and far more admirable. Eve never hated the Brady Bunch. She respected what it gave her. She just knew that if she kept saying yes to Jan, she might never be able to say yes to anything else. And for a young woman trying to define herself outside of bell-bottoms and sibling rivalry, that was a risk she could not afford. She pursued more serious acting roles in the years that followed. Eve did not become a household name as an adult. She didn't headline blockbusters or reinvent herself in a streaming drama. She simply lived, on her terms, quietly, decisively, proudly. Sometimes she showed up for reunions, sometimes she didn't. Not out of spite, but out of choice. Because once you have built a life outside the spotlight, it is easier to walk past it. Eve Plum was Jan Brady, but she was also an artist, a thinker, a woman who chose identity over nostalgia. And in a world that loves to keep child stars frozen in time, she reminded us that it is okay to grow up, to move on, to leave the set behind and not look back. Because there is strength in knowing when something is over and choosing what comes next. Taron Noah Smith was the youngest of the Taylor boys on Home Improvement. He was the wide-eyed, goofy one, always asking weird questions, always getting in trouble, but in the best possible way. He was not just a background character, he had a presence, a kind of innocent honesty that made him feel like everyone's little brother. But once the series wrapped, Taron vanished. Not a pause, not a break, a full stop. What made his disappearance stand out was how intentional it seemed. He was just 16 when Home Improvement ended, and he made it very clear he was done. He wanted nothing to do with Hollywood, no spin-offs, no sequels. He did not even want to act again. Instead, Taron went in a completely different direction. He started a vegan food business, bought a house, tried to live quietly. But the press kept coming. People were obsessed with his choices. He had gotten married to someone 16 years older than him. He was investing in offbeat business ideas. And all the while, he was still just a teenager trying to figure it all out. There were legal battles with his parents over money he earned as a child actor. There were stories about him rejecting the Hollywood lifestyle. But Taron kept doing things his way, even when it did not make sense to the people watching from the outside. Today, he lives almost entirely off the grid. Occasionally, he pops up in an interview or news piece. But he is not chasing the spotlight. He is not nostalgic about the show. He does not miss the fame. And maybe that is what makes his story so rare. He walked away before the machine could chew him up. Before the headlines, before the downfall, he disappeared while things were still good, on his terms. When you rewatch Home Improvement, it is hard not to smile when you see him. That kid, so full of life and timing. And then you wonder what it must feel like to have had that much attention, and to choose a life where no one knows your name. If you were a kid in the early 90s, there was a good chance Miko Hughes gave you chills. He played Gage in Pet Sematary, creepy, tiny, unforgettable. Later, he delivered the famous "boys have a penis, girls have a vagina" line in Kindergarten Cop, and just like that, he was cemented in pop culture. Miko was not just cute, he had range. He could be terrifying, hilarious, and heartbreaking, sometimes all in the same scene. There was an intensity to Miko that most kids his age simply did not have. He could steal a scene without raising his voice. He worked a lot after that. Guest spots, horror flicks, and even a small but powerful part in Mercury Rising. Directors loved him. Audiences remembered him. And then, Silence. Not dramatic silence, not the scandal kind, just the kind where one day he was everywhere and then he was not. No big announcement, no meltdown. Miko just slipped away. Part of it was growing up. Hollywood has never been great at helping child actors make the jump to adult roles. The parts dried up, the spotlight faded, and before anyone could ask where he went, the world had already moved on. But Miko never stopped working entirely. He did some voiceover, small films, and conventions. He even directed a short film. Still, most people only remember him as that unsettling little boy with the soft voice and intense stare. What makes his disappearance so quiet is that it mirrors the roles he played. Blink, and he is gone. But when you see him again, that face still pulls something out of you. Nostalgia, unease, curiosity. Miko Hughes did not burn out, he did not crash, he just grew up in the shadows of the roles that made him. And that kind of legacy is hard to outrun. Animorphs was one of those shows you watched with your face close to the screen, not because you were excited, but because you were confused, scared, and absolutely hooked. It was not polished, not even close. The special effects were low budget, the lighting was strange, but the story? The story was unlike anything you had ever seen. Teenagers turning into animals to fight off a secret alien invasion. That alone was enough to grab your attention. But then came the darkness, the questions, the weight. What happens when you cannot turn back? When war makes you lose your humanity, literally. Animorphs was not afraid to go there. It took big philosophical themes and squeezed them into a teen drama that never let you get too comfortable. Each transformation came with a cost. The characters were not superheroes. They were scared kids forced to carry secrets bigger than they could understand. And underneath the sci-fi weirdness was a terrifying truth. Sometimes growing up means becoming something you do not recognize. The show was intense, quietly tragic. It made you think about sacrifice, identity, and what it means to protect the people you love, even if it means losing yourself along the way. Animorphs was messy, yes, but so is adolescence, and that is exactly why it mattered. Tasha Yar was bold, strong, unapologetically fierce. As chief of security on Star Trek: The Next Generation, she brought grit and grounding to the bridge of the Enterprise. Then, in Season 1, she was killed by an alien force with barely any ceremony. Her death felt abrupt, underwhelming, even random. But that was not the end of her story. Yar kept coming back in strange forms, alternate realities, time loops, and even as a cloned villain. Each version chipped away at her legacy until it became unclear which Yar fans were supposed to remember. She became more concept than character, a symbol of creative guilt playing out through convoluted canon. What began as an impactful loss was slowly diluted by repeated reimaginings. Instead of giving her the honor of a full goodbye, the show kept rewriting her shadow. And in doing so, it left her fans unsure if she was remembered out of respect or out of regret. Was she the tough security chief who stood her ground, or a recurring phantom kept alive by narrative guilt? Behind the scenes, actress Denise Crosby left due to frustration with how little her character was being developed. The writers tried to make up for it, but in trying to keep Yar alive, they muddled what made her matter in the first place. What happens when a character dies too early and then lives too long in the wrong ways? Taran Noah Smith was the youngest son in Home Improvement, the awkward, often forgotten middle child of the Taylor family. He grew up on screen, his voice deepening as the seasons passed, his expressions maturing as America watched from their living rooms. But behind the jokes and tool puns was a boy who never asked for any of it. Fame was something that happened to him, never something he chased. When the show ended, Taran was just 17 years old. He did not celebrate his Hollywood success. He walked away from it, completely. He distanced himself from the industry, from the money, from the spotlight. Instead, he turned towards something far more grounded: veganism, sustainable living, building homes with alternative materials, and running a food company that served organic meals to schools. While others searched for ways back into television, Taran planted his feet firmly in the soil, literally. His story is not flashy, it is not headline-grabbing, but it is powerful. He has spoken about how alienating childhood fame can be, how it distorts your sense of self, your future, your place in the world. Taran did not want to be remembered for punchlines or reruns. He wanted to build something real. And while the world may have forgotten his name, it is clear he never forgot who he was. There is something beautiful about a child star who grows up and becomes exactly who they needed when they were young. Taran Noah Smith disappeared from our screens, but maybe that is because he found a better way to show up in the world. Alex D. Linz had one of those faces that defined an era. If you were a kid in the early 2000s, you knew him, even if you did not know his name. He was the kid in Max Keeble's Big Move. He was in Home Alone 3. He was always playing the underdog, the clever kid, the one who would outsmart every adult in the room. His energy was infectious, his timing always sharp, and then, just like that, he was gone. There was no grand exit, no dramatic role that wrapped it all up. He simply stopped appearing in films, and for a child actor who had been everywhere, it was confusing. No one really expected Alex D. Linz to just vanish. As it turns out, acting had never been his long-term goal. After a few more television roles in his early teens, he quietly walked away from Hollywood. He chose school, studied hard, pursued a completely different life, and he never looked back. There was something refreshing about how low-key it was. No social media goodbye, no "Where Are They Now" tour. He just exited stage left and let the spotlight land on someone else. But for fans, especially those who watched his movies on repeat, it was bittersweet. He had been part of so many Saturday afternoons, so many sleepovers, so many moments where the only thing that mattered was whether the kid on screen would win in the end. And then suddenly, that kid was gone. Rewatching Max Keeble's Big Move now feels strange. It is still funny, still smart. But there is a ghost of something there, a sense that we never really got to see what Alex D. Linz might have become. Or maybe we did. Maybe he knew exactly when to leave. And maybe that kind of quiet exit is its own kind of happy ending. No noise, no burnout, just a clean break from a loud business. Chad Allen was that rare mix of heartthrob and talent, one of those child actors who seemed to fit in anywhere. On Our House, he played the sensitive grandson in a multi-generational family. On My Two Dads, he showed up as the charming boy-next-door type. He had that windswept hair, the serious eyes, and the kind of presence that made casting directors feel like they struck gold. For a while, Chad Allen was teen television. He was the kind of actor who could break your heart with a look and make it okay again in the same scene. There was a real emotional fluency there, something that did not need a script to be felt. He had fans, he had momentum, he even had awards, and then he vanished. Part of that was intentional. Chad came out as gay in the early 2000s, but the outing was not on his terms. A tabloid outed him with a photo. At the time, that was still considered career suicide in a lot of circles. Roles dried up, casting calls slowed, and Hollywood, as progressive as it likes to seem, was not ready to make space for an openly gay leading man, especially one who had grown up in the public eye. So Chad took a different route. He turned toward activism, became a prominent voice in LGBTQ rights, went back to school, studied psychology. While the rest of the world waited for a comeback that never quite arrived, he was doing the hard, quiet work of becoming someone new. He officially retired from acting in 2015, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He said his purpose had changed, and that acting no longer felt like the right vessel for his voice. It is a story that is hard to tell without some sadness. Chad Allen had that thing, that spark. And it is easy to imagine a different world where he kept rising, kept shining, kept being part of the culture. But real life pulled him in another direction. The kid with the camera-ready smile and serious eyes turned into a man who wanted more than applause. And in the end, he vanished, not because he was forgotten, but because he needed to be found by something else. The Mystery Files of Shelby Woo was a quiet revolution. A teenage girl of color solving crimes on television without needing superpowers, a makeover, or a boy to save her. Shelby Woo worked hard, harder than anyone around her. She interned at the police department. She took notes. She asked the questions no one else did, and she always found the truth. She was not flashy, she was not loud, but she was brilliant, determined, sharp as a tack. And maybe that is why her show has been so forgotten, because it did not scream for attention. It earned it. Week after week, Shelby solved mysteries that were never too scary, never too simple, but always full of human details. A stolen trophy, a hidden letter, a secret someone would do anything to keep buried. And Shelby followed the trail not with gadgets or gimmicks, but with focus, with heart. She listened, she watched, she paid attention, and she always believed that the truth was worth the risk. The show did something rare. It gave us a girl who was allowed to be serious, not snarky, not quirky, just focused and full of fire. And it did not feel forced. It felt earned. Shelby Woo showed that being smart was not a flaw, that being curious was powerful, and that being different was not something to hide. It was something to build your life around. Watching her now, you realize how badly we still need stories like this. Girls solving problems, kids being taken seriously. Mysteries that matter, not because they are dangerous, but because they are real. Shelby never needed a cape. She just needed a notepad and the guts to keep asking questions. Kathy Sims arrived in The Office's 8th season like a quiet ripple before a potential storm. She was introduced as Pam's maternity leave replacement, but it was quickly made clear she had her eyes on more than just the receptionist desk. Kathy was flirty, subtle, calculated. She began targeting Jim Halpert, a fan favorite and the other half of one of television's most beloved couples. Tension built. There were long looks. A hotel room encounter that never went too far, but went just far enough to make fans squirm. She was not just a distraction, she was a test, a mirror held up to Jim's moral compass, one that shook the comfort of the show's romantic idealism. And then the test was thrown out, the mirror cracked, and no one wanted to look at the shards. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, Kathy was gone. No final scene, no resolution, no consequences. She simply stopped showing up. The writers never addressed it. Jim never mentioned her again. Pam never found out. It was as if the emotional bomb the show spent episodes building had been quietly diffused in the night. Behind the scenes, the backlash from fans may have influenced the decision to drop the storyline. But the silence left behind was louder than anything Kathy ever said. Her role was uncomfortable, and her presence disrupted the show's romantic backbone. But that's what made her interesting. By wiping her away without closure, The Office missed the chance to explore something deeper. Temptation, guilt, emotional fidelity. Instead, we were left with a character who became little more than a threat the show was too afraid to finish. What does it say about love stories when we are only allowed to remember the parts that feel safe? Michael Oliver was the kind of kid who could turn chaos into comedy. As Junior in Problem Child, he was everything the title promised. Wild, loud, hilarious, and just a little dangerous. He was not your typical sweet-faced Hollywood kid. He was a troublemaker you could not help but love. And then, like the perfect punchline to a joke we did not see coming, he was gone. His exit was sudden, but the signs were always there. The Problem Child films made money, but they also made problems. Legal disputes, managerial chaos, allegations of financial exploitation. Behind the scenes, Michael's world was unraveling before it even had a chance to begin. By the time he was a teenager, the industry had already burned him out. He did not just step away, he stepped back into anonymity. And he has rarely looked back. Today, Michael lives far from Hollywood's orbit. He is not trying to reclaim fame. He is not on reality shows or writing tell-all books. He is just living, quietly, on his terms. And that silence says more than any interview could. It says he chose peace over applause, privacy over profit. That, maybe the only happy ending left for a child actor, is to become someone the world forgets. It is easy to think of these stars as lost, but maybe they are not lost at all. Maybe they just escaped. And in Michael's case, maybe disappearing was the bravest thing he ever did. Ashley Aston Moore was unforgettable, but the world somehow forgot her anyway. You may remember her best as young Chrissy in Now and Then, a film that became something sacred for a whole generation of girls. That movie was everything. Summer nostalgia, growing pains, friendship, and feeling understood for the first time. Ashley stood out even in a cast full of future A-listers. Her comic timing was natural, her expressions effortless. She made awkwardness feel sweet and made every scene she was in feel warmer. But not long after the film's release, she simply disappeared. There were no major scandals, no splashy headlines, just silence. She did a few guest roles, a television movie here and there, and then gone. While her co-stars rose through the ranks of Hollywood, Ashley's name slipped out of the credits and out of memory, except for those who remembered and missed her. The truth came years later, in the worst possible way. In 2007, Ashley Aston Moore passed away at only 26 years old. The cause was an accidental drug overdose. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The disappearance, the distance, the silence. Behind it all was a young woman who had struggled deeply after childhood fame faded. There is something especially haunting about child stars who leave no final message. It is not just about career. It is about how easily people can slip through the cracks when the cameras stop rolling. Ashley never got a second act. She never got to grow into a new version of herself on screen. And yet her performance in Now and Then still lives in people's hearts. Sometimes when you rewatch that film and you see her smile or crack a joke, there is a strange ache you feel in your chest, like you are watching someone frozen in time, someone who made an impact and then vanished. No goodbye, no send-off. Just a quiet exit from a loud world. There was a time when the name Tina Yothers popped into your living room every week without fail. She played Jennifer Keaton on Family Ties, the youngest sibling, sharp-tongued, slightly sarcastic, and weirdly wise for her age. She was the grounded one in a house full of strong personalities. And let us be honest, standing out next to Michael J. Fox was no easy job, but somehow she held her own. Week after week, America watched her grow up in real time, right there on the family couch. But what happens when the couch is gone? When the lights dim, the scripts stop coming, and the world moves on? Tina finished out the series and disappeared. Not in a way that screams scandal or heartbreak, but in a way that feels more like slipping out the back door unnoticed. One day, she was a household name, and the next, you would have to Google her just to remember what show she was on. It was quiet. Almost too quiet. Part of the reason? Hollywood had no idea what to do with her once she stopped being the kid. She tried music, a rock band actually. Blonde hair, leather jackets, the whole vibe. But the industry never gave her the same spotlight she had as Jennifer. And unlike some of her co-stars, she did not chase roles just for the sake of staying seen. She also chose something that feels almost radical in the world of child stars: privacy. She focused on family. She stayed out of trouble. She lived a life most former celebrities would kill for, one with peace and no tabloid drama. And that, somehow, made her vanish even more. You do not realize how much someone meant to a show until you try watching it without them. Tina was the glue in Family Ties. She was the reminder that being the kid did not mean being forgettable. And even if the world forgot her for a while, that little spark she brought into every scene still lingers. It is not just nostalgia. It is recognition. Jennifer Keaton might not have gotten the spin-off. Tina Yothers might not have gotten the comeback. But she gave us something better: realness in a world of scripts. The Puzzle Place was one of those shows that never needed to shout to be heard. It just knew exactly what it was saying. You probably do not remember the name of every puppet or the exact town they lived in, but you remember the colors, the kindness, the honesty. You remember that feeling when everyone sat together and worked through something real. The Puzzle Place was about friendship, yes, but not the easy kind. It was about learning to understand someone who was different from you, different skin, different family, different story, and still choosing to care. These puppets did not just teach diversity, they lived it. They argued. They misunderstood each other. They asked big questions and stumbled through the answers together. Each character had their own voice, their own culture, and their own point of view. And for a children's show in the 1990s, that was groundbreaking. You were not just watching another Be Kind show. You were seeing race, religion, culture, and conflict in a way that felt gentle and real. Sometimes it was uncomfortable. Sometimes it was funny. But it was always human. And it never felt forced. What made it work was that the problems were never too big to feel fake or too small to feel pointless. They were just big enough to matter to you, big enough to echo in your own life. Watching it now, you might wonder how it ever got made. A show this intentional, this thoughtful, this honest about what it means to be part of a community. The Puzzle Place let kids ask the hard questions before adults told them not to. It gave you space to think, and more importantly, space to feel. And now, looking back, you realize it was not just a kids' show. It was an early lesson in empathy, one we all probably needed more than we ever knew. Ben Geller was Ross Geller's son from his first marriage and Friends. He was there through the early seasons, sometimes adorable, sometimes awkward, but always a reminder of Ross's complicated life. But somewhere around season 8, Ben simply stopped showing up. He was not mentioned. He was not seen at family events. He was not even referenced during major milestones in Ross's life. It was like he disappeared into a television black hole. And unlike many vanishing characters, Ben's disappearance felt especially personal, because Friends was all about relationships, growth, and adulthood. How could Ross continue to date, move in with Rachel, and raise a new daughter while his first child simply ceased to exist? Behind the scenes, the producers shifted the show's focus away from parenting and more toward the core group's friendships. But that does not change the emotional cost. Ben was a symbol of a life that was not so easily erased. There was no scene of Ross explaining why Ben was not around, no call to say he was staying with his mother, no tension between Ben and baby Emma to justify the separation. The father-son bond, once so central, was replaced with complete silence. And with that silence, the show quietly asked us to pretend that fatherhood had an expiration date. It was as if a decade's worth of storytelling could be undone with one unspoken decision. What kind of narrative leaves out a child like a dropped punchline? For a show that defined a generation, this choice says more than any joke ever could. And yet, in the world of Friends, he vanished without a trace. What does it say about a show and maybe even a generation when a child becomes inconvenient to the plot? Mara Wilson did not just play magical girls, she was one. To anyone growing up in the 90s, she was the bright-eyed child who brought life to characters we adored. Whether she was teaching a cruel headmistress a lesson in Matilda or navigating grief in Mrs. Doubtfire, Mara had a presence that was impossible to ignore. She had a warmth that could cut through any screen and land softly in your heart. And then, almost overnight, she was gone. Not fallen, not broken, just elsewhere. As it turns out, Hollywood was not the sanctuary it pretended to be. Mara's decision to leave was not sudden, but it was necessary. The industry that once celebrated her began to suffocate her. By the time she was a teenager, acting felt more like a performance off-screen than on. She was growing up in a space that did not allow her to grow. So she walked away. From the lights, the scripts, the expectations, and toward something truer. Mara became a writer, an advocate, a voice for children who never had one. She opened up about mental health, grief, and what it meant to be a child star when the cameras stopped rolling. And while we lost her as an actress, We gained her as a witness to a world most of us never see. The one behind the curtain, the one without the glitter. Her words became a new kind of performance. Honest, brave, and often heartbreaking. Some child stars fade because the world forgets them. Mara chose to disappear because she remembered herself. And in doing so, she showed us that there is life after the applause ends. A life of purpose, of survival, of healing. That might be the greatest role she has ever played. If one story hit home, share it below, like the video, and subscribe for more untold moments.